Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Gateway Spotlight. We are excited to be back on the mic. We've been on a little bit of a hiatus for a while now, so I'm very excited to be starting a new season, hopefully, with this great conversation. I think we had over 100 people register for this event, so that's really exciting. Clearly, it's a topic everyone is very interested in learning more about and talking about. My name is Brooke Roberts. Obviously, I'm the host of the Gateway Spotlight. I'm also the Director of Partner Marketing at Podium Education and the founder of Inside Study Abroad. And today we're talking about the UNS, specifically, do they have a place in education abroad programming? In 2015, the United Nations adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, as a universal call to end poverty, protect the planet, and improve lives today and in the future. The SDGs provide a comprehensive framework for sustainable development that address economic, social, and environmental challenges at large and are based on a vision that no one should be left behind. They aim to be achieved by 2030, which we're not far from, which can only happen if all sectors, governments, businesses, NGOs, educational institutions, and the public come together, get involved, and build partnerships to create a better future for everyone. As more education abroad professionals and organizations incorporate the SDGs into their programs, today we're going to discuss interesting ways the UN SDGs are being leveraged in international education at large and what, if any, impact the incorporation of UN SDGs has on student perceptions, decision making, and experiences in global programs. I want to welcome you all again to our first episode of the Gateway Spotlight this year. This is an interview series designed to highlight diverse perspectives, next generation initiatives, emerging trends, and innovative thinkers in international higher education community. And today I'm joined by two international education colleagues who are strategically putting the UN SDGs to work in their organizations. And you're going to hear all about how they are leveraging them in this conversation. We have Ravi Raj, founder and CEO of Authentica, a study abroad program provider focused on immersive experiences across the Asia, Pacific, and European regions, as well as the Middle East. And we have Roberta Espinoza, PhD, Vice Provost for Global and Local Affairs and Professor of Sociology at Loyola Marymount University, where as the inaugural SIO, she developed the university's first internationalization strategic plan. Welcome, Roberta and Ravi, to the show.
Thank you so much, Brooke.
Great.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So if all y'all know Roberta and Ravi in real life, be sure to say hello in the chat. Maybe share some of their fun secrets with us so we can all get to know each other a little bit better. But before we dive into the meat of this conversation, I want to learn a little bit about each of you and your more personal background. And if you could share briefly a little bit about your international education story and specifically how you found your way into our little corner of the world in international education as a profession. Roberta, I'll start with you.
Great. Thank you, Brooke. I appreciate the opportunity to share my personal story that brings me to this work for which I have great passion. I think my passion for global education has been cumulative over my life, beginning with my childhood in an international/global familial household and living in a predominantly Latinx immigrant community. I think those early exposures to peers who really embodied the knowledge, skills, and attitudes required to thrive in an interconnected world as part of their lived everyday experiences really primed me for international experiences later in my life, such as studying abroad in Toledo, Spain during college, conducting social science research in Mexico and Mexico City, the DF, after college, before starting my doctoral degree in sociology at UC Berkeley. A really pivotal moment, however, if I could really pin something in my academic career, occurred when I was a tenured faculty member at a small liberal arts college with a focus on promoting global education. In fact, they even had an intercultural understanding global/local course requirement for students. And at that time, when I joined, the Associate Dean of Global Local Programs convened our cohort of new faculty at his home for dinner and really encouraged us to integrate global and local foci into our courses and our scholarship. This meant developing community-engaged courses with our local partners and adopting a global or international comparative focus with our research. When this was put in front of me as an invitation, I really took this to heart because it really connected with my my personal experience. So I began mapping out what this would look like for a new research agenda to compare educational inequality, access, equity, which is the focus of my research as a sociology of education scholar. And I started looking at it in different contexts and countries. And this really got me excited about this work from that vantage point. I also taught a first-year seminar that included global local experiences for faculty and students. And this led to my first faculty-led program with fellow faculty and our students, and we all went to Costa Rica. After that experience, I was convinced about the numerous benefits of global learning for myself and really importantly for my students. That segued my career, and I ended up serving for 3 years as the interim associate dean of global local programs at that institution, which really marked my first informal, I say, senior international officer position that gave me this really invigorated passion for global education as an administrator focused on DEI. So I was really bringing the internationalization to my work with equity and access, which was the exact place I needed to be positioned in my professional career. And now that brings me to my current role as vice provost, as you had mentioned, for global local affairs here at Loyola Marymount University. I'll refer to it moving forward as LMU, where I'm completing my 6th year on June 1st, charged with overseeing campus-wide internationalization efforts and global learning for all.
I love hearing stories like that. So from that faculty track, when you first entered into the PhD land, if you will, did you know that that an SIO role existed, or it could be a future career track for you? Or were you thinking tenure track all the way, teaching sociology would be your future?
Honestly, I didn't. My pathway on a variety of different, my pathway has never been linear. I'll just say that. I didn't know what an SIO was. To be honest, I'm a first generation college student. So I didn't even know what tenured track faculty member, what that entailed, what it meant. I didn't know that was a career pathway. So that in and of itself was new to me. But again, as I was making my way up the educational ladder, I got these exposures that have been really pivotal in changing the course of where I headed in every different direction. But no, honestly, I didn't know.
Yeah.
But once I found it, I knew I was in the right place.
Yeah. Found your people.
I knew this was the trajectory I wanted to be on. So I continued on that path.
Awesome. Great. We're going to turn over to Ravi's story in just a second, but Roberta has me curious. I would love to know, for all of you watching, type first gen in the chat if you are also a first gen college student. I'd be very curious to see who in the room also can relate to that experience and identity. And Ravi, let's turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit about how you found your way into international ed. I know a little bit about your story, so this is me wanting to hear it again, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I have to say that when I think about my journey into international education, I'm reminded about Steve Jobs' graduation speech at Stanford University, where he said, you can only connect the dots looking backward, not looking forward. I look backward at my career, and I can say that probably intersection of three interests that eventually led me here. The first is definitely education. I come from a family of educators. My mom was an educator, my aunts and uncles were educators. And growing up, I grew up in India. And one of the huge influences that I had was Mahatma Gandhi, and specifically on his beliefs in education. He basically said, learning happens best with the head, hands, and the heart. So it stuck with me for some reason, hearing that. The second interest was community development, probably a function of being surrounded by educators. I was raised to believe that we have to use our education skills and opportunities to make the world a better place. And I've always been driven by that belief. So when I went into graduate school, all my essays were around social enterprise, and all my electives that I took during graduate school was around social enterprise. And there was a specific fellowship that I got when I was in grad school, which is all about integrating sustainability into mainstream curriculum. Because largely in education, things are a little bit different now. But 15 years ago, when I was in grad school, sustainability belonged in the realms of alternative electives and stuff. It was not integrated into the core curriculum. So my big project was to integrate sustainability into core curriculum case studies, because I went to business school at Dartmouth and we used a case method. So I sourced cases and advocated for these cases to be used in the core curriculum, which they did the following year. And the third interest I would say is travel, right? I love travel. Growing up, didn't have a lot of money to do it. My favorite book was The Atlas, and my hobbies were collecting stamps and coins from all over the world. And I used to know every single country's capital, currency, etc. So it really gave me a big kick. And again, it makes sense to me that I'm doing what I do now. But the career path was not linear, as Roberta has mentioned. I started off as with an engineering degree. I worked in software engineering, initially in India, and then with companies like Verizon and AT&T in New York. Knew that was not my calling, went to grad school, did my MBA. I worked in strategy consulting for a couple of years, where helping technology companies with their marketing and corporate strategy. I took those skill set and switched to the social enterprise sector, where I worked with in the homelessness sector in the UK, helping charities become less dependent on government grants and come up with ideas for which they could charge money and become more financially independent. So that sowed the seed for me. And the final straw that broke the camel's back was I had a really interesting experience in Paris when British Airways lost my bags traveling from London to Paris, and a kind lady next to me offered me her address to put into the form so that they can deliver the bags to us. And as we're leaving the airport, she said, "Look, I have a spare apartment on top of my apartment. I bought it because the neighbors were making too much noise. So I bought it so I can leave it empty and sleep peacefully." And she said, "You're free to stay there for as long as you need to till you get the bags, as long as you don't make noise." So I lived for a week in Paris, in Montmartre, walking distance to Sacré-Cœur. It was my first time in Paris, and what an incredible way to see Paris. And I thought, this is amazing and serendipitous, but what if we can actually make this more the norm than the exception when we travel abroad? And that's how the name Authentica was conceived. And that's really a few months later, I quit my job, moved to India, and started Authentica. That's how I am in international education today.
I love it. That's a great story. As an entrepreneur myself, I love those stories where I just quit my job and left it all behind, and which is it's never just an up and to the right graph from there, of course, but very inspiring. Thank you both for sharing those stories. Both of you hinted a little bit about your paths leading to this moment in having the UN SDGs be a central part of your work and how you're structuring your work and programs you're designing. So let's start with some nuts and bolts so we can all have the same language about what you're each doing when it comes to the UN SDGs and how you're leveraging them in various ways. We did do a pre-call just for everyone's knowledge. So they're both doing a lot with UN SDGs. And if we went through every single point of all the things that they're doing, this would be a 5-hour experience. I've asked them both to give us the highlights, maybe the top 3 components of what they're doing. And of course, they'll trickle in the other elements as we continue this conversation. So, Ravi, I'm going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about how Authentica is leveraging the UN SDGs in your work. How would we see that and see it manifest at Authentica?
Yeah, first of all, even before the term SDGs was coined in 2015, because the company started in 2013, sustainability has been a core for the company. We had a responsible travel policy in place even before we ran our first program. So it's in our DNA. The way to broadly describe how it manifests in our work today, I put it under 2 buckets. The first is thought leadership and advocacy, which is where we do a lot of, I would say, contribution to the community. For example, the Forum on Education Abroad's guidelines for advancing SDGs. I was on the working group and I co-authored the guidelines. We also conceived the idea for incentivizing the education abroad community to come up with an award. So we have Forum on Education Abroad award for SDGs that Authentica continues to sponsor. We also had a chapter that we wrote in decolonizing study abroad because we thought there was a lot of mindset changes that needed to be done, and we're part of a collective to contribute to that cause. I'm currently a NAFSA Sustainability SIG co-chair, and we are organizing a few things at the NAFSA conference coming up later this month. And we also share best practices at various conferences, NAFSA Forum, Global Internship Conference, etc. So that's how we push the agenda on thought leadership and advocacy. The second bucket, I would say, is practice leadership. So now doing what we preach. That largely comes in two forms. One is actually designing programs that are usually open enrollment programs that advance SDGs. Examples of programs are Social Innovation Lab in Malaysia and in India, Earth Action Lab in Singapore, Humanitarian Engineering Fieldwork, and all of these programs are designed to apply the principles of SDG and advanced SDGs while you're actually doing discipline-specific work. So they're all project-based learning. They range in duration from 2 weeks to 8 weeks, and they're all designed to maximize on opportunities to advance SDGs. The other way in which this comes into play in our practice leadership is regular programs that are not SDG programs. This could be like learning about the business and economy in Australia, for example. We make an attempt to reduce the impact on such custom programs. We run sustainability workshops. We try to use public transportation wherever possible. That's part of our proposal. Minimizing single-use plastics, giving students an opportunity to fill up their water bottles using refillable containers as opposed to using single-use plastic. And in the case of project-based learning or internship projects, we choose organizations that are advancing SDGs and place students, build capacity for these organizations, because they're working on projects with these organizations that advance SDGs. And we also have a way to engage with local communities in an equitable way. So prioritizing their needs first and identifying conditions for engagement with them, as opposed to we, as the clients who are paying them the money, setting the rules, we have them involved in the conversation and we engage them in the discussion so that we are having as much of an equal relationship in the process as possible. And through all of these things, we want to shift the mindsets of everybody involved as stakeholders, right? As that includes students, faculty, other international educators, etc. So that's broadly how our work manifests as thought leadership and advocacy and practice leadership.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Roberta, tell us a little bit about what's happening at LMU. How are you leveraging the SDGs?
Sure. And this is really, I think, more of a higher ed perspective and a little bit of an aerial view. I think of these as categories. So our categories are focused on faculty, students, and collaborations with staff and other units. We did, as an institution, go through the American Council on Education's Internationalization Laboratory shortly after I stepped into my position. Of course, we were carrying that out in the heart of the pandemic, which was a bit of a challenge. But from that, we, as part of our recommendations, decided to adopt the UN SDG framework for our global engagements and global learning moving forward. And as a result of that, we have now incorporated or embedded different initiatives, and again, in those three categories, for how to actually provide opportunities for example, and I know you've asked us to hone in on 3. I have a list of 12, but I'll try to just hone in on the 3 for this particular segment, because they're, I think, concrete examples of some of the ways in we're working with those 3 different constituency groups. Curriculum development grants for faculty. So we've implemented a global local learning curriculum development grant that encourages faculty across disciplines to integrate the SDGs into their curriculum. So they can either revise a class, they can create a new class, but it's really getting them to think about the ways in which they both bring that into the classroom, have discussions with students around that particular content piece and or module, but they're also hopefully engaging with that as an instructor in that teaching learning process. So that's one of the ways in which we kind of leverage this agenda with faculty and get buy-in. Another way in which we do that is we collaborated with our College of Business Administration, CBA. They have a center within it called the International Business Ethics and Sustainability, IBES. We partnered with them, and I have to say CBA Business at LMU was ahead of the curve. when we first adopted this framework, and they had already started rolling out some things and doing some of this work. So I want to give a shout out to them. We collaborated with IBES, that center in CBA, to create a UN SDG student ambassadorship. So this was one of our many faculty initiatives. We developed the ambassador program, and it was really designed to immerse a group of students in the SDGs to raise their awareness about it, but then also use their ideas and their ways of thinking. And we really called it a program which we co-designed and co-created with them so that they could take on a leadership role with that kind of awareness campaign initiative, and also do some peer-to-peer resource gathering for students. So I would say the SDG student ambassador with the partnership across our campus was another way in which we did that. Another example is collaborating with, we have on our campus CSA, the Center for Service and Action, and our area, Global Local Affairs, GLA, provided scholarships to students for their global learning experiences, which they do shorter term spring break or December, May experiences. They have these alternative break trips that focused on the SDGs. So we intentionally had a conversation with their longstanding programs about using this framework and adopting it for their alternative breaks so that they could focus on particular themes and topics that connected with the 17 SDGs. And we provided scholarship funds to first generation and low income students so that they could both engage with this experience, have this experience, but also be thinking about it with that framework of the UN SDGs. So I would say we really have tried to map out intentionally what we can provide in those categories, what we can provide for faculty, what we can provide for students, and then what we can provide in partnership with staff members across the campus to really leverage the SDG framework and also do that awareness building across different units on campus.
I want to talk about the topic of socialization in a minute, so we'll pause that for a second. But a question for you, Roberta. When you were first at that strategic planning phase, whether going through the ACE incubator, I forgot what that was called, the ACE experience, and you zeroed in on the SDGs as that framework you would use as an institution, what, if any, pushback did you get from key stakeholders when this was being discussed before it was settled? Did you receive any hesitation, concerns from faculty, staff, administration, students? I don't know who was involved in that decision making. Was there any pushback? I can't imagine it was like smooth sailing. And how did you respond to that pushback?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it was pushback per se. It's more of that awareness building to educate the community about what they are, what they signify. You can probably see I'm wearing this pin, and this is something that I do intentionally as a part of that socialization. It's a conversation starter. It's an entry point to have discussions with folks across campus. My team members all have these. And so we really try to introduce the SDGs with that framework and have intentional conversations about them. And again, we're doing it through these other kind of nuts and bolts that you talked about, these other categories to get buy-in and engage everyone in the community in the conversation. But we really just tried to do that awareness building. I don't think that was necessarily pushback. More, I would maybe shift the paradigm on that to position ourselves to get buy-in on this is the framework that is universally used, that gives us a platform in which to engage with our international partners. It allows students something in education abroad when they're out and in the world, having their global learning experiences, to be able to have a connection point and a shared understanding of this is something that has been adopted more universally, and here's kind of the way in which I can see myself playing a part in the work that we all need to do together, which I think very much is the spirit of the UN SDGs.
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective and a good paradigm shift there. I want to turn it to Ravi to talk a little bit about one of the cool things that each of you has as an advantage as Roberta, you said, coming in your new role, you got to lay the foundation for what internationalization would look like at LMU moving forward. And so you could come in and have this, like, I don't know, pretty strategic plan with the UN SDGs as a central focus. And Ravi, obviously, as the CEO and founder, you could decide this is what we're doing and this is how we're framing what we do. A lot of people in our field, we don't have that luxury. We can't just overhaul everything we're doing and now reframe it around the UN SDGs. But people here attending might still want to leverage the SDGs in a meaningful way. And the best asset they have is the programs they already have on the books, stuff they're already doing. So I'm curious, Ravi, what advice or tips you would have for people who want to start layering in the UN SDGs in some way and how they might retroactively map what they're doing to the UN SDGs?
I think that's a great point, Brooke, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and it's just too much. 50, 60 years of study abroad programming, especially in North America, don't want to kind of throw it all away and then go for the new thing for SDGs. So I would break down my recommendation probably into 3 buckets. So first would be think, second would be talk, and third would be tools. The 3 T's. I would say in many ways, sustainability starts with the way you think. So what's the relationship between the institution and the local communities that we're working with? So take, for example, the power divide. Now, inherently, we have a power divide, especially in service learning kind of programs, where as a client, we have some degree of power, but there are ways to reduce that. So it can be as simple as if you're already working with communities and on service learning or other project-based learning programs, you can shift the power by just engaging them more in a discussion. Say, hey, we're thinking of doing this. What do you think? Are there things that we cannot do in the community? And for example, I'll share an example in a program in India. This is a humanitarian engineering program. We're taking a group of Australian students to a village in India. They were going to stay there for 2 weeks and work on projects that were a priority for the community. And basically, the community, when we asked them the question, are there some conditions for engaging? They told us that, you know what? Yeah, we have a condition. You can't use toilet paper because we don't have septic systems that can handle toilet paper. And that was a bit of a shock for the stakeholders a little bit. So basically, we included a training for how to use Turkish toilets for a 1-hour training, which is a very interesting session. But the students adapted and they were there for 2 weeks, and it's an ongoing relationship that we have with the community. But again, these are ways in which we can just think without any cost, incurring any cost to shift the way we deal with local communities. The second would be talk, right? So first is saying, second is talk. Talk to people. There are people already doing stuff in this space. LMU shared examples. There are other universities that are doing some really interesting stuff. Meet them at conferences. If they're an exchange partner, talk to them. For example, Western Sydney University in Australia, they are the highest in the impact rankings on the Times Higher Education ranking, because similar to LMU, they do things university-wide. It's not just study abroad. So there are people who are a little bit ahead of us or quite ahead of us, but it's a collaborative space. They're friendly people. They'll share best practices. I think so. Definitely talk to your peers who are doing this stuff. And I can see some questions that are already asking Roberta about short-term programs that they do. So that's the kind of conversations you need to have. And also talk to providers like us. Quite a few providers are aligning themselves to SDGs. And we are very happy to talk, to share best practices. And of course, there's interest of business, but also as ecosystem players, we want everybody to be taking SDGs seriously. And the third, I would say, is tools. There are quite a few tools coming out. The ones that I'm really I would advocate for is the Forum on Education Abroad's guidelines. So it's an excellent resource. I'm a bit biased because I co-authored the document, but I really believe that document has a almost like a playbook. There's a table that talks about things that you can do in your office when you're running your study abroad programs, like not printing stuff as much as possible, digital distribution of material to market to the students to come in and do study abroad. There are conversation questions that you can ask the faculty. Like, for example, in the proposals that faculty have to write, just including a question saying, how do you think this program would advance SDGs? Makes it very intentional for the faculty to start connecting a program that they already have. I've been running it for many years, but just looking at it through the lens of sustainability. And so those are tools available. They're no cost. They're available freely on the website. I'm happy to share a link through any conversations that we have later on. So I would say these are the three ways in which we can retrofit existing programs, thinking about it differently, talking to people, and using tools that are out in the industry.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm just going to throw in an example in my work at Podium Education, our flagship program, the Global Career Accelerator. They have this well-oiled, dynamic curriculum with a lot of case studies, specifically global case studies and co-designed projects with companies all over the world. But they weren't initially designed thinking, okay, UN SDGs. But when we went back and essentially did an audit of them, and just so you all know, very high tech over here, it's a spreadsheet where we documented every single sort of case and project and that students might go through and work on throughout the course of the experience. And then we looked at each of the SDGs and said, oh, does that fit? Oh, they're talking about water rights in this part of the world. Oh, that would fit under SDG, et cetera. And so we found that our existing program that we'd spent a lot of time and energy and knowledge building out already mapped, I think, to maybe 10 different SDGs. Don't quote me on that. And so that was really exciting for us because we were like, well, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We can start layering this in. And what we did is inside each of those individual cases or projects, we added essentially a blurb and sort of a little teaching moment for students to say, this project also reinforces the UN SDGs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is what the SDGs are, and did a little educating in the process. It doesn't overtake the program. It's not like, oh, this is all about the SDGs, but it's just little nuggets that students can walk away going, oh, now I want to learn more about the SDGs. Maybe now they can use it as a talking point when they are vetting companies they might want to work for in the future, or they could talk about it in interviews, et cetera. That was just one way that we didn't reinvent the wheel. We didn't overhaul our program. We just took what we already did and mapped the SDGs to that. And I think as we develop more in our curriculum, we will be more intentional about thinking, okay, what's a UN SDG that we haven't really touched on in our curriculum thus far? And maybe we can start reaching out to partner companies to come up with those projects that do align with those other SDGs. That's the advice I would give is crank out a spreadsheet and start mapping out all their different programs and offerings that you have, and then just start saying, oh, that really aligns with this, and then start brainstorming and getting creative on how you can basically educate students on that connection later on. Roberta, I want to kick it over to you. Somebody brought up a really great question in the chat, and I do want to be mindful of time and make sure that we do have plenty of time for Q&A. So we have about 5-6 more minutes of our conversation. So, Roberta, how are you measuring success? At the end of the day, the end of your tenure in 2030, for instance, is the goal of the UN SDGs. How are you going to know that LMU did it right? What are your KPIs, your key performance indicators that this was a success or maybe missed the mark?
We are very much a work in progress. So many of these things that we've rolled out, we've done within the last year and a half. So we are, to your kind of characterization of a spreadsheet, we are trying to write, and I like the language that's being used here about mapping things out, making things more intentional for students, especially in terms of their career outcomes and career readiness. These definitely have some benefits, and we hope that over time we have KPIs that we can measure that will map onto the success of our students, both as they're having their educational experience, the to and through piece of whether they're undergrads or graduates, however that plays out. But we're doing our best at the beginning to do a pre, and then at some point we're going to pick a moment where we do post assessment of those KPIs to see if we're getting a lot of stuff that we walked into when we first adopted this as we were building awareness and started to embed and integrate it. We were piloting many things. So we were piloting curriculum development grants. We were piloting collaborations. We were piloting the SDG Student Ambassador Program. So I think we still are very much kind of tracking that data. And certainly we're going to fold it into the larger institutional strategic plan that has interdisciplinarity, high impact practices, DEIA work at its forefront. So we're locking into those strategic plan goals. The other thing I really want to say here is that we really are connecting this framework to our mission as a Jesuit institution. And the vision of our new strategic plan is, and I'm going to read this, in fulfillment of its mission, LMU will form a new generation of ethical leaders able to identify, analyze, and respond to the most challenging problems facing our rapidly changing global society. There's also been a mandate by the Pope under a Laudato Si umbrella, where he has endorsed the UN SDG framework and gave everyone a charge to start doing this work. And there's even a website that shows alignment of, based on what the Pope is asking faith-based institutions or individuals of a particular faith, or even if you want to angle it from an interfaith perspective, there is this mandate of, we are all in this world together. Let's create the world we want to live in together. And I think a part of that is really engaging with, at least at LMU, our mission, taking that charge from the Pope very seriously and operationalizing what does it look like at our institution specifically, and how are we going to put things in place and implement things that carry out the work that's being asked of us to create students equipped to enter the world as problem solvers and to have the skill set that they need. And a lot of this, I believe, really comes from a better understanding of the SDG framework and the social inequalities that are woven into what they represent on a lot of different levels, from gender to education to health and well-being. I offer that as LMU has a really unique position in this as a Jesuit Catholic Marymount institution. And so this, for us, it maps on quite nicely. But back to your original point, those KPIs are really something that we're moving towards, and we hope to flesh that out a little bit a little later on in our work as we gain the momentum that we were hoping for through all of these different 12 initiatives that we put in place in the last year and a half.
Yeah, it's hard to measure outcomes in at least in academia. Like a year and a half is not a lot of time, so I can commiserate with that as well. The thing I'm really curious about, and I could be wrong, so you guys can both tell me that I'm wrong. I'm open to it. That's fine. But I think about Gen Z, and I think about the TikTok generation, and the UN SDGs are heavy. It's like a heavy, very serious topic. How are you both getting students excited about the UN SDGs? How are you getting them to care that this is I mean, I think they recognize it's important, but how do you get them to think about it beyond just like that academic speak that we tend to rest on as educators, for sure? But how do you get the TikTok generation to frankly give a damn?
I'm happy to start. Oh, sorry.
Yes, Ravi. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead, Ravi.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I don't think it is the TikTok generation, but the millennials are also a generation that care quite deeply about their future, right? I don't think it's a hard sell. We do want to ensure that we provide the concepts in a palatable form, right? And I think it's really about just design. So, for example, we run a workshop on our open enrollment programs. That's empathy mapping, and introduce people to sustainability as a concept. And we do that through pictures and identify development versus exploitation and things like that, where students actually visually see the concepts at play in the locations that they're doing their workshops in and their study abroad programs in. So that develops a very direct connection between what they're experiencing in the location and these concepts of sustainability. So experiential learning and doing experiential learning well is key to this for them to kind of feel. Like I said, Gandhi said that learning happens best with the head, hands, and the heart. So you need to somehow get into the heart for them to register that in the head. So otherwise, it may not happen, or it may not live for very long. So I'll give a very tangible example of this. So we had a marketing student who wanted to do an internship. You can pick up digital marketing skills, social media stuff on a variety of different projects, but we chose to place the student on a project where they were working with a digital marketing agency that had the World Wildlife Fund, the WWF, as a client in Thailand. And the project was, we need to run a campaign to increase awareness about poaching, about the use and export of animal products. Number one, it's illegal. Number two, it's just wrong. So the students basically were doing a digital marketing project, but we added on a layer of impact and caring for the planet. And that's SDG 15, life on land, for you right there. So you're not having to trade off the skills, doing well and doing good. So I think it's really important that we don't see this as a trade-off. Or you can either do SDG aligned programming, or you can pick up some skills for your jobs. So you can actually do both. So that's how I would approach it. Very good experiential learning pedagogy, and building it into the design of the kinds of projects and work that you do, interaction with stakeholders that you do on the ground in local communities. And it just starts with having the intent to do that. After that, things are relatively easy, surprisingly easy. That's our experience.
Yeah, I think this is kind of a trick question a little bit, because Jennifer and Jessica in the chat here have talked about how they think that their experience is that Gen Z is actually quite excited, and millennials as well. So to your point, I would agree with that. And that faculty can often be the barrier here to getting them on board to leveraging SDGs. So Roberta, I would love to talk, and there's a few questions that came in related to this, but how are you working with faculty to intentionally and meaningfully layer in the SDGs to their courses, their faculty-led programs that they might be leading? How are you working with them to get them excited about incorporating the SDGs in some way?
It's funny that you jumped off of a comment in the chat from Jennifer Ramos, because she is actually a part of my team and is the director of global learning. And so a lot of the work that she does in this effort is working closely with faculty to, and again, a lot of it is just, and I agree with Jennifer, I think that this generation cares very deeply about social inequality issues. We see what's happening on campuses in higher ed right now. That is coming from a place of care. They just maybe don't necessarily have a concrete framework from which to understand and address some of the challenges. This notion of climate anxiety, it's a phenomenon that is worrying this generation. So I think there's just this really wonderful portal and opportunity to use this framework and have them lean into it to realize what agency they have in all of this, and how they can be action oriented with these problems, and how they can play a part in starting to chip away at solving some of these larger challenges and issues. So I think that's a real area of opportunity. From my kind of faculty vantage point, and I'll reach back to that, my current position is mostly administration. Before that, I would always straddle administration and being in the classroom. I very much approach my pedagogy as teaching and learning, period. I learned so much from my students. So I think there is both working with faculty, working with them individually, bringing them to a better understanding, doing that awareness to what the SDGs have to offer, how they can connect them to all of the different things that they have to do with their courses, their research, their service. And there's intentional ways of doing that. Even in a curriculum development grant, for example, when we ask them, which of the 17 UN SDGs does your class connect with? And it's putting out in front of them in a really intentional way to, okay, there's more conversation about, okay, what are these? What do they mean? Some folks have a little bit of an understanding of them, so maybe that conversation doesn't need to be as deep, but even starting those initial conversations via a curriculum development grant really opens things up. And hopefully from our perspective, opens up their thinking about, I do have a lot of things that connect with this, but it's intentionally embedding it in applications so that faculty have to think more deeply about how exactly does what they're doing, the content, the delivery, the pedagogy, how does it connect with this particular framework? But again, that's the faculty piece, but students teach us so much. And that's one of the reasons why we were all in with the SDG student ambassadors, because they are helping to create educational toolkits and identifying registered student organizations on our campus and giving them awards for the work that they're doing that aligns perfectly with either 1, 2, or 3 of the SDGs, and lifting that up and spotlighting that that's also a learning moment for faculty as well, to know that their students are engaged with research or registered student organizations. All of them have some type of connection with an SDG or multiple that is very meaningful in the work we're doing together. So it's finding those slipstreams and finding how we thread the needles of going back to what you said, what already exists, and how do we add and layer onto that a better understanding of this work actually has a trajectory and it's work that we all need to be invested in, and just making that a very meaningful exchange or opportunity for them to see how this framework can contribute to the work that they do.
One thing I will, and researching and prepping for this, one thing I did do is I did go on to TikTok and I used the search function and I looked for various formats of UN SDGs, UN sustainability goals, UN goals, all sorts of various things. And there's some really interesting and I think encouraging content being created out there. And I know TikTok, there's all the other platforms as well, but I think that generation is paying a lot of attention to TikTok. And so that might be a great place to start, even if they're not your students or what have you. But being able to take a video where a young person that a student can relate to is talking about a particular SDG, you can embed those right into a web page or share them on your own socials to socialize students to the importance or what even the UN SDGs are. I think that would be an interesting way to think, put on your marketing hat of like, how is a student going to resonate with this and how could I deliver this information in a way that piques their attention or interest. So yeah, definitely go check out TikTok. Lily Singh, I don't know if you all know who she is, but she has millions of subscribers on YouTube, pretty famous creator. And I think she's partnered with the UN or some adjacent organization, and she has a whole and she's hilarious, comedic format, and it's really interesting. So if for your own entertainment, go do a little learning on the UN SDGs and look up Lily Singh's videos on TikTok as well. So I want to turn it over to Q&A. We've gotten a bunch of questions in the Q&A area. I know that there's a lot of great conversation happening in the chat. Thank you all so much for being involved. As we jump into Q&A, let's just do a little quick check-in. Give me a globe emoji in the chat if you are already leveraging the SDGs in some way, even if it's a small way at your organization or campus. I would love to see who here is already doing some things with the UN SDG. Give me a globe emoji of some kind in the chat. So we got a couple, Abby and Robin. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. Keep them coming. Thank you. And if you're not just yet, but you're inspired to, give me a plane emoji just to see what you're thinking. Oh, I have a new idea on how we could start doing this at our organization. So moving on to some questions. Vasilis asked Roberta, can you please talk more on the short-term programs that LMU has that involve the SDGs? And that's all the detail that they gave. But yeah, maybe talk a little bit about either the program planning component or existing programs where you've retroactively incorporated the SDGs. If you could talk a little bit about that process and what that looks like.
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to that collaboration we had with the Center for Service and Action with their alternative breaks. And this was another team member of mine, Maria Melendrez, had worked with someone at CSA because we were going to be providing scholarships to first generation low-income students for their programs. And their global learning programs are fabulous, very long-standing. I don't think when we had the initial conversation, it was going to be framed in any particular way. So they lodged that UN SDG framework into their application process. And they used that and put it out in front of students so that when they were thinking about how to select a program, for example, they were having more intentional conversations of, if this program is focused on ecology and water, this program is focused on some of these other issues. They were putting that out in front of them as a part of their discernment for which program they chose to engage with. And so for some of these short-term programs, and this was something we did when they had already planned some of these out, and then they lodged it and incorporated it into their application process. And it was a real opportunity to collaborate on, okay, how are these helpful in framing some of these shorter term programs that we have? And why are students engaged with a program in Guatemala versus a program in Puerto Rico, based on the focus of those, and then the backsplash of that being SDGs as an informative process. And I think that goes back to, Brooke, what you had said earlier about that socialization piece. Those are the moments, right? It could be the smallest of moments. It could be a much more robust than that. This was our first year doing it with them. I'm sure now that we have more planning and more runway in planning, that will look a little bit differently. But the fact that we could move very quickly to incorporate it and have students think more intentionally and purposefully about it, those really are the moments where I think you get traction. And then closing the circle later, which we hope to do, is how can they translate these experiences to career readiness, to career outcomes? Yes. How do they map this onto what it looks like for their resume? Mm-hmm. Those are things that we're starting to think out towards for what is the true impact of this. So it will take some time to really understand the true impact when we have maybe a cohort of students who have done many of these things. But I think this is some of the work that Global Local Affairs at LMU is doing, but that some of the larger work that LMU as a whole, as an institution, is also chipping away at and making strides towards right now.
One of the things I think is very exciting, and this kind of leads to a question I have for both of you as we wrap up here. And thank you everyone for being here on this live section. I think at our max, we had about 75 people here. So that was really exciting. Thank you all for being here. It's clearly a very hot topic right now. One of the things I think is exciting is that obviously, whether it's in a small way or in a super formal embedded way, like both of you are doing, students are becoming aware of this framework and these goals and this mission. And as they enter the workforce, they are going to be asking these future employers, so what is your commitment to the UN SDGs? How is your division actually incorporating and layering this into your work and what you're thinking about? Because this brings me to my question is, in July, the UN released their report. What's happening with UN SDGs? Where are we? Are we going to hit this goal? And I think the quote I found is that the world is woefully unprepared to deliver the SDGs by 2030. And I don't want to be a doomsday person here, but that was like disheartening to see, like just last year, that was the finding, that while there's a lot of like high level commitments, especially from industry, when you get down to the more granular sort of subtopics and KPIs and actually measuring and tracking and all these implementation ideas that these big corporations committed to, they're not really doing the work at the sort of application level. But I'm hopeful that this new generation going into the workforce is going to push that dial, and corporations are going to have to say, oh, maybe we shouldn't just say we're doing something, maybe we should actually do something. So I think that's encouraging. So even though that's a little bit of the doomsday perspective, I would love for all of you to leave us with some hope for the future of what the UN SDGs could mean for all of us as a society, of course, in education abroad specifically. And then also, I would love to know what's next for each of you at your institutions. What's the next project or initiative that you want to get off the ground as it relates to the UN SDGs, so we can all get inspired as well? So give us a little hope here.
Okay, I will go first. All right. Okay. Personally, as far as Authentica is concerned, we have a couple of things that we are working on. One is by end of 2025, we're committed to being completely carbon neutral. Now, is that going to solve the world achieving SDGs by 2030? No, but I'm contributing to the direction. I think individually, each of us should be just thinking about that. Just add to the momentum. Just get started. We don't have to do anything remarkable, but collectively we can do something remarkable. So it says that people on the call do one thing to make their programs more sustainable. That's a start. So for us, after having been in this space talking about SDGs for a few years, because we need to put stake in the ground. By end of 2025, we will be completely carbon neutral. Our vision for 2030 is that we would like to see and also create or contribute to creating an industry where sustainability is not a choice, but it's something that is woven into the fabric of how we think, how we talk, and how we do things. So we don't have to have a session on sustainability separately. It's just what we do, just like we do risk management at study abroad. So sustainability is one of those things that's woven into the fabric of study abroad. So that's the world I'd like to see, and that's the world that I'd like to create.
Hey, Roberta, what do you think?
Yeah, and I'll try to be as brief here because I know we're running, we're at the top of the hour. I just want to say that when global tragedies happen, as hard as they are, they're catalysts and portals for developments in other areas. I see this, and maybe that report, that 2023 report, it's very sobering. The language is, what it is. I think we should not see it as defeat, but a call to action to reinvigorate resilience. The SDGs were designed not to just be targets, but a roadmap. Roads don't typically end in ways that we think. They sometimes split apart. They take us in a different direction. Clearly, my career was at the beginning of this conversation very indicative of that. And I think this roadmap needs to continue, and we need to continue to dedicate ourselves to it, to take us to new places, to set new aspirational goals, to tackle all of the problems that are ahead of us. And I think the SDG framework, even though it was framed as a 2030 initiative, I think it's a framework that is going to expand beyond that. And I see a lot of hope in just continuing to dedicate ourselves to engaging with it, engaging with one another. I think for me, if the pandemic taught us anything, it was that we can achieve things together out of necessity. It proves our commitment. We can resource it. It was an international collaboration in many ways, and we accelerated that progress together. So although it was very challenging and difficult, I really do think there's, for me, and that's shifting the paradigm to positive reframing, there's a lot of opportunity with this framework. There's a lot of work to do, but there's a lot to look forward to because we've seen it happen. And there have been those sparks of hope that, at least at LMU, we are going to continue to leverage that platform in ways that are productive for our students and our student-centeredness, and then the things that the individuals that we want to develop and equip to enter the world to be leaders and to take those tasks on and to be at the table and to be problem solvers. So I think there's a lot of hope in seeing this generation take on those roles with passion and care, because then I feel like the framework and us as individuals or collectively as educators, we will have done and played a part in that.
I love it. Those were amazing words. I feel hyped up now. Thank you so much, Roberta and Ravi, for having this conversation. Thank you so much to everyone who attended today. We will be sending out a recording of this conversation. So if you missed any of it or had to log off early, don't worry, you will get to hear all of it. And I just want to give a special thanks to Ravi and his team at Authentica for sponsoring this episode of the Gateway Spotlight. We really couldn't do this work without you. So thank you so much for everything you're doing, specifically with the SDGs and beating that drum throughout international education and being a great voice for that work. So thank you all so much. Definitely go check out Authentica's website and what they're doing. So thank you everyone for being here. Roberta, Ravi, everyone else, have a wonderful day, and we will see you in the next Spotlight. Bye.
Thank you so much as well.
Great to be here. Thanks everybody for joining.